I could just have everyone's attention just for a brief moment. My name is Mark Warner. I'm a graduate of Boston College as well as the law school. I presently have the pleasure of serving on the alumni boards actually of both schools, and it's been my privilege to do so. As you know, this is the Dean Series, and it's one of many education programs sponsored by the Alumni Association. It's an opportunity for our deans to swap their dean's cap for their professor's cap and talk to us about a subject they love. It's a breath of fresh air for them, I assume, but it's definitely a breath of fresh air for us as well. Our guest speaker tonight is Dean Vincent Rugo. I had the distinct pleasure of meeting with Dean Rugo as he settled in as the newest dean of the law school this summer and fall. It's an exciting time for the law school, and I'm sure this continues to be a very busy transition for the dean, and we truly appreciate his willingness to come and speak with us tonight. Prior to joining the BC family, Dean Rugo was a professor of law at Notre Dame, having served as their associate dean for academic affairs from 1999 to 2002. He received his A.B. magna cum laude from Brown University in 1985. Now, Dean, 1985 is the critical date at BC, because that's when Doug Flutie graduated.
We heard all about it in Providence.
You've heard of him, right? And you received your JD from Harvard Law School in 1988, where he served as articles editor of the Harvard Human Rights Journal. An expert in Catholic social thought, Dean Rugo's most recent book, Christians in the American Empire, Faith in the New World Order, was released in 2008 by Oxford University Press. I'm actually holding a copy of it right here, and the dean has been kind enough to bring some volumes of his book, which will be in the lobby area as you leave the presentation tonight. We have a one-night-only special where it's 20% off of its regular price, and I believe that brings it to $25 if I have that right, Jean. Okay. Tonight, Dean Rugo will speak to us about democratic citizenship in diverse urban spaces, which addresses one of the emergent realities of our current economic crisis, that large metropolitan centers with diverse economies and populations have generally fared better because of their ability to draw in new residents and jobs. But a critical challenge that has emerged is how to create a sense of community and citizenship in neighborhoods that are often home to migrants from around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dean Vincent Rugo.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight for a number of reasons, and one is for one reason is the one Mark mentioned. It's nice as the dean to finally be back doing what I came into this to do in the first place, to be a professor or be in that role, to talk in that role. Although I feel I'm a bit off my game, so you'll have to forgive me. This first year of being dean, if you've probably heard from other deans, is an extraordinary experience. It's like someone points a fire hose of information at you and just turns it on. And you're trying to deal with so many different things. It's challenging, it's interesting, it's maddening, it's fun, but it is exhausting at times. But I'm really, really pleased to be able to talk about work I've been doing in terms of my research over the last couple of years since I wrote the book, and to get some feedback on some of the things I'm working on from you, and to talk to you about some of the things that I'm doing and some of the things that I'm seeing. So yes, the title of my talk is Democracy and Difference, and it comes from my own experience working over the last several years actually in London. And I'll be spending a little time at the latter part of the talk talking about that. But you might wonder, well, gee, I mean, how relevant is London to what we're doing here in Boston? But I think it's particularly relevant because I think London has emerged, as a lot of our own cities are emerging, as what we might call world cities, where people from everywhere go and people meet and create lives there, and they're creating a kind of new cosmopolitan environment, particularly in Europe and North America, although not exclusively. And that's really changing so much about how we understand our cultures, how we understand our economies, how we understand our democracy, the way we understand different relationships within it. And for me as a law professor, that's particularly interesting because a lot of the debates we've had about different things will have to be rethought, and the way we discuss a lot of these things will change because different groups are involved in the discussion now. So what does that mean for how we understand, for instance, the relationship between religion and the public sphere? When we're talking about new groups, new religious groups, when we introduce Muslims and Hindus and a much more vibrant and larger group of secular people into the environment. So all of these things are occupying me, but I'll try to condense it into something that will be very conversational and fun for us to discuss tonight. So let me start by framing things a little bit. The three themes I want to work with you on tonight are the emergence of these dynamic multicultural metropolitan centers in the global economy. I mentioned London, but London's not the only one. We've got a lot of them right here, New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles. They may not, New York and London may be the two that are most similar, but really on a lower level in terms of size, a lot of the same things are happening in most of the large American cities. What we'll be looking at is, how this whole dynamic affects, number two, the economic, cultural, and political challenges that are raised by this development in these societies. And then I'll give you some more information on what I've been doing with multi-faith community organizing in London. And the reason I'm focusing on that is because to me, it demonstrates a really wonderful way forward. It's taking groups of people from all over the world who find themselves in this dynamic setting in a great democracy, who have to come to terms with how they're going to live together, how they're going to negotiate various spaces, how they're going to become good citizens that respect democratic traditions, but also recognize that because the groups and the types of issues have changed, some of the ways we understand the way we do things will also have to change. Some of the ways we understand what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what we want to focus on as a society, all of those things will become somewhat different. We will also be exposed sometimes in our own countries to things that we thought were only happened in other parts of the world, because people from all over the world are now amongst us. So how are we going to deal with some of those challenges? And to me, the bottom line is, how do we form democratic citizens around shared concerns for social and economic justice? To me, that is the way that I think we'll forge a new kind of cosmopolitan citizenry in these large urban settings. Because at the end of the day, the fact that we share geographic space, that we form communities together because we live together, because we're raising families, because we're concerned about our jobs, because we want to live in peace and harmony at the end of the day. That's why so many people leave other parts of the world to come to places like North America and Europe, because they have a hope for themselves and for their children that they'll be able to get the things that we sometimes take for granted. And so how will we welcome these travelers from abroad into our vibrant and hopefully increasingly multicultural democracy? So those are the things that we'll be talking about tonight. I'm going to start by talking about us, about the United States. And I'm going to use to do that a recent book called Patchwork Nation. The authors, Chinny and Gimple, have had they've been on public television a bit, and they have a website, and I'll be looking at that too. But they've come up with a theory that we aren't really one nation in the way we like to think, or the way we are often preached to by our politicians anymore. We're actually 12 nations. And that's not to say we're not unified as Americans, but it's to say that as Americans, we live and we experience life in 12 very different countries for all kinds of reasons that I'll get into briefly. I'm going to focus on some of those nations, the ones at the bottom. But before I get there, I want to just go very quickly through the 12 nations and just give you a brief commentary on each one, because I think it's important to situate this discussion a little bit. So Cheney and Gimple divide us into these 12 areas. The first one is boomtowns. Boomtowns are these places that up at least until 2008, people were sort of flooding into because they sort of represented new opportunities. They were often at the periphery of major metropolitan centers. The exurbs is what I like to think of. So for those of you who are familiar, say, with, I don't know, like the Washington, D.C. area, so if you go out to like Frederick County, out towards western Maryland, or Loudoun County, past Dulles Airport. Those types of places where you could get a good house, but the reason people were drawn there is they had good jobs, but they just want a little more. You know, if by going farther away, they could do more. And the jobs followed them, and there was a lot of economic development. The place they focus on here is a place in Colorado near Vail. And you can think of Vail as another sort of center of a lot of economic activity in the tourist industry, but you know, a little farther out, you could have a lifestyle similar to Vail, but not so expensive. So that's another way of thinking about it. Similar to DC, but not so expensive. Going up to Nashua, New Hampshire, for instance, same kind of exurban experience. Group, it's Campus and Careers, they call it. I'm going to use their names. I don't like them all, but I'll use them. Campus and Careers. Ann Arbor, Michigan. You know, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Cambridge, even though it's part of a metropolitan area, it's a Campus and Careers location. People who live in college towns have a very unique experience of living. You know, it's very heavily young. There are a lot of people at the beginning of their careers. There's a lot of research and development going on. It's a very vibrant economic space. It tends to be a fairly diverse space, and it sort of gives people a very different impression of the world around them. Empty nests. The empty nests are places like a lot of the areas of Florida and Arizona where you get a lot of retirees. And the interesting thing about the empty nest areas of the country are that the retirees come down and they're older and they're basically trying to reproduce a life that they had before in a nicer, more hospitable climate or whatever. So it tends to be more conservative. Incomes aren't low, but they're not vibrant and high, they're stable. A lot of people are on fixed incomes. And they're not as dynamic. They don't tend to attract immigrants. They just tend to be, as I say, very stable, comfortable, and conservative. Evangelical epicenters, places typically in the Deep South, the Intermountain West, amongst other places, but those are the most concentrated areas that are very traditional, very conservative, very focused on large numbers of primarily Protestant evangelical congregations. And that creates a very unique kind of worldview. The presence of religion in the public sphere is much more profound, much more oriented to sort of a Protestant conservative vision of that, but not exclusively. And those areas tend to be areas of concentrated people. So it's not like they're sprinkled around the country. They tend to concentrate in certain ways. Yes, you can find them everywhere, but where they have the most sort of influence are in these concentrated parts of the country, in the Deep South in particular. Immigrant Nation, similar kind of phenomenon. You see in the Southwest, Arizona, places like that, Texas, large concentrations of immigrants primarily from Latin America and Mexico. So there's a much more conscious sense that it's a bilingual area. There are, there's a much more, I don't know, sort of immediate sense that the country is changing in those areas. And there's a lot of inflow, a lot of people coming in. Industrial metropolis. Now we're getting to some places that you think. The industrial metropolis is a place like New York or Boston or Philadelphia or Chicago. Densely urban, maybe also including their close-in suburbs, but the traditional city. Lots of in-migration, lots of economic activity, something that we'd be very familiar with here in the Northeast. Military bastions, places where there are lots of military bases, lots of military dependents. That's pretty self-explanatory. Minority central. The Old South, again, what used to be called the Black Belt, which was not because of the people, but because of the soil, but the Atlantic coastal plain down through the Gulf Coast, is still an area where the cultural makeup is pretty much about the black-white divide. There's still a deep legacy of the traditional Southern culture there, and it hasn't changed very much, and that's really the primary cultural and social issue in those parts of the country. The moneyed burbs, self-explanatory too, but that area typically of big metropolitan centers where there has been a tremendous influx of wealth, stability, high-income earners, Middlesex County here. So the western suburbs of Boston, most of the suburbs of Boston, really. And there are a couple of others that are less important, but more rural ones. So I don't want to waste too much time on it because I want to spend time on the ones that are important to us. Most Americans live in industrial metropolis, moneyed burbs, boomtowns, service worker centers, which I didn't talk so much about, but these are areas of the country that are heavily dependent on service industries, tourism, other types of support industries. In other words, money comes in because people bring money in for some reason, not because it's produced or there's anything being produced there. So, but a lot of people live in those they tend to be the mid-level cities, you know, some distance away from the big industrial centers, but they are a big part of the population. And the immigration nation that I mentioned, like the Southwest area, that's 233 million people out of 310 million people, all right? So what I'm trying to set up for you here is, as I go through these other groups, most Americans are experiencing life in one of these sectors, all right? So that's going to become important. So of that 233 million people, 192 million of them live in an industrial metropolis, a moneyed burb, or a boomtown. These are using their language. That's pretty much the life that most of us are experiencing. Boomtowns, I'm having a little, here's an explanation. All right, so there are 41 counties in the United States that we would call industrial metropolises. They're the nation's big industrial cities and some of their inner suburbs. I described them a little bit for you before. 286 counties, moneyed burbs, and 384 counties that are boomtowns. And I didn't go in through them, but they're relatively wealthy areas that are booming, or that were booming up until 2008. Growing rapidly with increasing, probably the exurbs. I did talk about them, sorry. So that's where most of us live. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, an interesting question to think about. Where is American wealth concentrated? And to do that, American wealth is concentrated, where the wealthy live. Now, when I say where is American wealth concentrated, I'm thinking about where is American wealth concentrated in terms of household income. I mean, there are a lot of different ways of doing this. But just in terms of these criteria or these groups that Patchwork Nation sets up, boomtowns, campus and careers, so the college towns, Immigration Nation, which is actually a relatively poor area, but filled with cheap labor. So I think that's something to think about. And the moneyed burbs and the industrial metropolises. So boomtowns, campus careers, Immigration Nation, industrial metropolis, moneyed burbs. So the point I'm trying to make here is, where do people live, for the most part? Where do most Americans experience their world? And where is wealth in the country? And so when you see this list, you have a much better idea, at least it's one way, of thinking about, well, where is wealth being generated, where is wealth being concentrated? Well, these are the places. It's not the empty nesters, it's not the evangelical epicenters, it's not the military bastions, although they're not poorly off. It's not minority central. So just to give you another idea here of some of the places I've been talking about, because now we have a map. So these places up here are the service worker centers, you know, sort of out of the way, smaller cities, the red. Industrial metropolises, you know, I mean, there are cities, I'll talk more about them, so I'm not going to spend it. This is minority central, what we call the old black belt in the history books. Immigration Nation in light blue. So Arizona, South Texas, places like that. And then, you know, these areas that are sort of multicolor and complex show places like the campus and careers, or what's the place I'm thinking of? Boomtowns, excuse me. So those are scattered throughout. But I don't want to get too deeply into this because that's a separate talk, really. But I think it's important, as I said, to kind of frame things. So now we can get a little bit more into I'll just show you the whole map there so you can see some of the different, I don't have an explanation of the colors, but that'll give you. All right, so let's move back to this. So where is American wealth concentrated? Money burbs, industrial metropolis, campus and careers, which wasn't in the list originally, but I added it, boomtowns and Immigration Nation. So those are the places we're going to focus on. Campus and careers has 13 million people. It's not that big compared to some of the other ones. Industrial metropolis, 54 million people. Moneyed burbs, 69 million people. Boomtowns, 59 million people. Service worker centers, 31 million. Immigration Nation, 20 million. But Service worker centers drop out when you think of where wealth is, okay? And moneyed burbs, industrial metropolis, campus and careers, boomtowns, and immigration nation pop up. So that's where American wealth is concentrated. And in those areas, when we add campus and careers with its 13 million people, we have 205 million people, all right? So 205 of the 310 million people in the United States live in these kinds of areas. In the industrial metropolises, immigrant population in 1980, 12% of the population of the industrial metropolises were immigrants. In 2008, it was up to 25. Now, this is nationally. This isn't looking at specific places, and I'll get to that in a minute. Population under 35 years old, just under 50%. In the moneyed burbs, 7% to 15% population under 35. In 2008, 45%. Boomtowns, not as much. The boomtowns tend to attract people who are trying to kind of get away from that, from the kind of diversity that we see in the moneyed burbs and in the metropolitan centers. So they tend to be less diverse, but still growing. Also very young. Campus and careers, we would expect it would be young, although it's still not quite what the population was in boomtowns. Immigrant population, relatively small, but still growing. Immigration nation, obviously, it's jumped from 7 to 17, population under 35, over 50%. So the youngest population in the country is in these areas we call immigration nation, which is typical with immigrants. Now, remember, that's just the general. That's the average. Let's look at the hard examples. Cook County, Illinois, so Chicago and its close-in suburbs, which range from extraordinarily wealthy, the Wilmettes, Winnetkas, to very, very poor, and everything in between. So it's actually a great example. 21% foreign-born in 2009. All of these are figures from 2009. Manhattan, 28.6%. But what's really interesting is Queens, 48% foreign-born. Now, the other thing I want to let you know is that's just people who were born abroad. But the influence of people who were born abroad can't really be tracked just by this number, because you have to think, well, some of those people are married to people who were born here, and the whole experiences of their children and their lives are affected by the fact of one parent being born abroad, or the whole neighborhood's experience of people will vary. People who were born here but born to parents who were born abroad may still be in that middle space. So it's just the tip of the iceberg. Boston, city proper, 28%. Middlesex County, 18%. DC, now this is sort of interesting, this is where I grew up. 13% in the city proper, but the city proper of DC is very small. 700,000 people, it's like Boston proper. The big counties, suburban counties, the wealthiest suburban counties in the metropolitan area, except for maybe one, 30, basically both 30%. So the wealthiest suburbs of the capital have a third of their population almost foreign-born. Atlanta, 13%, and it's one of its immediate suburban counties, 16%. Think, well, that doesn't look so impressive after these other numbers, but think about it. 30 years ago, would you have imagined that 16% of the suburbs of Atlanta would be a population that was foreign-born? Hard to believe. Houston, 25% foreign-born. And Houston is really, what, the third largest city now in the country? Or fourth? It's up there. Seattle, driver of the economy, 20%. Yes, I have to repeat your question. Yes. Well, they're coming from all over the world, but increasingly they're coming from new places for us. They're coming from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, to a much larger extent than we've ever known. Because prior to 1965, the United States had strict racial quotas, and people from those places were not allowed to immigrate. Once those quotas were lifted, well, pent-up demand. But really what was happening is that the world was changing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So we see high concentrations of wealth in areas of high immigration, the big cities, and some of these other areas. Again, I should do a little bit of a caveat here. I'm not saying this is causal. I'm just saying this is factual. I'm not trying to make a social science case. But this is the world we're living in. This is the world we're experiencing. And it seems to me that the places where people are well off, where there are a lot of jobs, where there are lots of people, are places that are very heavily influenced by immigration and very diverse. And of course, as I say, the metropolitan areas in particular are more diverse. Now, there's been some interesting writing on this by one author in particular who makes a much more detailed case. And if you want to read about some of this, Richard Florida, who's been in a lot of the media around these questions, he has an interesting website if you want to look at it. He's done 3 books. He's done more than 3, but these 3 books, The Rise of the Creative Class, The Flight of the Creative Class, and Cities in the Creative Class, sort of explain this phenomenon in more detail. Just to condense, the new economy demands people who have high knowledge-based skills. And a lot of these people actually are also in work that we would call very creative. They're inventing things, they're making things, the new things of the economy. You know, they're designing computer programs, they're designing computer software, they're designing you know, the new technology of the future, they're building things, all kinds of things, but they need a lot of education, and they actually are working not just based on sort of rote activities, but on a sort of creative and imaginative ways. And one of the interesting things about that is they want to be around other people like themselves. So they flock to the urban centers. And it's one of the reasons why Seattle became so popular. You know, Seattle was a desirable urban center. People in the computer industry go there. Silicon Valley, all of these places, Boston, Washington. Smart, well-educated people like to be around people like themselves, but it's not just because they're being snobs, it's also because the opportunity is maximized that way. Because if you're in an industry that's concentrated in a particular area, if one job doesn't go well, you're around other people who do other things, you can move easily to other types of employment. Your value as an employee is enhanced because you have more mobility. It's better for you, it's also better for your company. I mean, they know that they can draw in a good source of labor. So that's at the top end. And of course, if you're generating wealth at the top, you're going to be bringing people in at the bottom to service all of that. They see opportunity for upward mobility, they see opportunity in the same ways that everyone else does. So up and down the social ladder, you're going to generate mobility and opportunity. So that's sort of the short story there. So this employment that drives the economy is concentrated in these places, Northeast Corridor, the West Coast, other big cities. Where are the immigrants coming from? They're coming from Latin America, Asia, Africa in larger numbers than ever before because of the question that was asked here. It's a new wave of people from new places. And the second part of my talk, after sort of laying this framework of where the energy is in our economy and in our culture and our country, is about the challenges. And the cultural challenge that this poses is that we have this new kind of immigrant who's not like our old kind of immigrant. One of the interesting things we see is that the immigrants of today, the immigration of today, is very similar to the immigration of the early 20th century in terms of numbers and percentages. The raw numbers are higher, but the country is bigger. But the percentages are similar, though not quite as high as, say, the early 20th century. But who were those immigrants? The Italians, Eastern European Jews, people who, yeah, they looked a little different from Northern Europeans, but they were still primarily Europeans. And there were lots of struggles in integrating those immigrants, but this is very different. Now we have this visually, starkly different immigrant. You know, the dark-skinned Latino from Mexico, the Asian, the African, the other. It's very obviously, you don't even have to speak or see, or you just see them, excuse me. You don't have to say anything, they have to open their mouths. There's a sense of difference. So people perceive this immigration in a much more profound way because it's just right there with their eyes. And of course, it seems much more foreign. So a lot of people who themselves have immigrant grandparents and great-grandparents have these very odd reactions to the new immigrants, partially because they don't look the same. So one of the other cultural problems is this kind of resentment, the backlash, the competition, the ugly debates over immigration that we've all heard. And a lot of the old inter-ethnic understandings are falling apart because they're these new immigrants and we don't understand them and they're not like us and they're taking away our jobs. There are a lot of real concerns around all of this. The economic challenge, we're in this period of profound global economic change, and this movement of labor is just as significant as the movement of capital. And we're much less insulated as a nation from these movements. We used to feel a sort of splendid isolation after World War II, and certainly before. We were the big man on campus. The other economies of the world really couldn't challenge us. All that is going away. And we're all suffering the sort of pangs of global economic change. And these new people from new places see this opportunity to come to the United States as a way to better their circumstances in the same way other immigrants did. So they're coming for economic reasons, often other reasons too, but big movements because of economic change are changing the way we live. So what is the political challenge? We're trying to build community cohesion now in our great cities, to focus on that, in our great metropolitan areas, based on very different kinds of migration, immigration, different people, and in a different kind of world. People feel much, this isn't the immigration, this isn't your great-grandmother's immigration, right? This isn't you leave the little village in Italy or you leave the shtetl in Russia and you are kind of so happy to get the heck out of there that you'll do whatever you have to do to assimilate. It's not like that anymore. It's, yes, there's a new opportunity here, but we have all this technology that keeps me in touch with home, and I might go back. I mean, like a lot of our Mexican-American families who maintain a kind of dual presence. They might have a house in Mexico while they're living in Southern California, and they go back and forth easily. Travel is much easier. You're not leaving forever necessarily. So how do you understand yourself in this new dynamic? Are you Mexican? Are you American? Are you Mexican-American? We see the same phenomenon in Europe with a lot of the Muslim immigrants. Am I Algerian? Am I French? Am I French-Algerian? And there are lots of things going on that make that assimilative process more difficult. We also at the same time have these growing economic disparities in our country here. And just all of this sort of debate and discussion about how we're going to spend our public money, right? And there's a lot of divergence in the political system. There's a lot of hostility around the future. And so all of this is coming at a time where things are very much in flux. So integrating immigrants into our political traditions is coming at a time when our political traditions seem to be in a very difficult place. You know, those of us, you know, who have been following American politics for a long time say all the time, gosh, it's really getting ugly. And it's getting ugly at a time when we really need to come to terms with some major changes. So that's a little bit discouraging. So, solution. So when I went to London, I was entering a city that basically had been in what I've just described that's been going on with us for some time. And part of the other reason I think London is really interesting is that it is an old imperial capital. And the thing that makes the European cities very interesting with immigration is that they're looking at this issue in a way that suggests kind of, you know, the results of a faded empire, because a lot of their immigrants are coming from, you know, the diaspora of the old empire. And one of the theories that is a big part of this area right now in political science literature and the philosophical literature is what you are seeing now with these new waves of immigrants are people who used to be seen at the periphery of Western civilization who are now moving into its center. So those Asians and Africans and well, less so Latin Americans, but certainly Asians and Africans, weren't really part of Western civilization except as colonials in our mind or as very foreign cultures. And then the Europeans went out and colonized these places and brought them in their minds into the civilization. And now they say, yeah, actually we are part of this, and we're coming from, we're going to live amongst you and work amongst you, and we are integrating into this global economy, going toward the wealth. I mean, the countries that were the centers of wealth are now becoming the centers of all kinds of things. And one of the big issues we're going to have to face is, well, how does that change who we are, and what responsibilities do we have in this post-colonial, in the case of Europe, post-civil rights, in our case, era? What does it mean for how we understand who we are? Well, in London then, we did a lot of work in the communities of East London, where we were working in neighborhoods where there were multi-faith, multicultural communities in the sort of entry point neighborhoods of London immigration. So you had the old British white working class living amongst Pakistanis and West African Catholics and, you know, Polish Catholics and, you know, Muslims from all over the world other than the Pakistanis. I mean, just this maelstrom of people. And the British government and British people are thinking, oh my goodness, you know, how are we going to make this into something that's a community that's stable? Of course, there were all kinds of fears, right? Fears of terrorism, rising crime, all these things. But most of these people are here for the reasons, or there for the reasons immigrants had always come to London. And that's something we sometimes as Americans forget. London has always been a big immigration place too, but it tended to be Europeans, you know, the Huguenots, other people from Eastern Europe. And you know, there are all kinds of patterns that have long been established in London that have continued today, but the people look different, and their new religions and their new issues. So what are we going to do to create a sense of community cohesion and allow these neighborhoods to thrive and allow people to feel a sense of membership in British society? So everything we were doing in London is really similar to what we need to think about here too. So we tried to focus on community needs that draw on this sense of shared geographic space, the idea that we're all Londoners, we're all New Yorkers. What are we trying to do here? And what are the problems that we face living together in community, and how can we attack those problems? And the way we did that is we had the communities, the members of the communities themselves identify to us what their major concerns were, the organizers, community organizers. And they came in and they would say, well, look, we're really concerned about crime, or poor schools, or jobs. Gee, well, that sounds familiar. And when we're focusing on those things, everyone wanted to work together. The Muslims and the white working class and the Poles all felt that this was something they could gather together around. So we tried to focus on those types of things. And there was a component as well where we gave law students a chance to work with these communities, and we hoped that it would help develop lawyers who paid more attention to social justice issues. Now, how do I understand my client of the future in a very multicultural setting? Is that going to be the same client that my father had or that my partners had when they came out of law school? And it's not. So this was the program we established. This was, forgive me, it was when I was at Notre Dame. I didn't have time to change the slides. One day that will say BC. We focused on the idea of the church's witness in a pluralist society because the way we organized our communities was through religious organizations. So of course my entry point was Catholic churches in London, and my colleague that I work with very much, there is an Anglican priest. And so he focused on the Anglican churches. And those places in Britain become sort of points of community gathering. And then we also got involved with Muslim community centers. So we used religious identity as a means for first of all, organizing groups in a safe space, and then bringing them together based on a shared understanding that as people of faith, people committed to the community, people committed to their families and their children, they wanted to come together to make their neighborhoods a better place. And this was a very successful strategy. So it's just a little background. So that was our practical engagement in the community. And so here, I'm almost done. Here are a few things we did. So we had several different community-based actions in London that were, again, not generated by us as academics. These were people in the community who told us what they wanted to focus on, how they wanted to live together, what issues they wanted to be galvanized around, and what would make them feel like they were more a part of the society. So one was obviously immigration. And so there was a campaign sponsored by London Citizens, which was the group, the community organizing group we did our research with, that did a campaign on immigration and asylum. You know, how do we integrate people who've been in the country for a long time, whether legal or illegal, into the society when we know they're going to be here? What are some strategies we could use? And so they were petitioning Parliament for some changes to the immigration laws. And as you can look at the crowd, it's hard maybe to see from your vantage point, but people from all over. The wonderful thing about this project was that I worked with students from the poshest British families who were at Oxford and who were spending their days with West Indian immigrants in East London, and who came out of it totally changed. Totally changed. As a matter of fact, just a quick anecdote, I was at the National Dean's meeting for the ABA, the American Bar Association, just last week in San Diego. And we had a presentation by this guy who does a lot of writing on law firms, the economic future of law firms. He's British. I sat down with him and said, oh yeah, I spent a lot of time in London working on these projects. I described it. He said, my kid was on one of those. I said, really, what's your kid's name? Oh, where did he go to school? He went to Oxford. I said, which college? Malden. I said, that's the college I worked with. Turns out he was one of my students. So this is transformative. You know, to hear these very wealthy kids from the best families in Britain where that kind of thing still has a lot of, matters a bit. And they're down with these folks at an immigration rally. And one of the things the dad said to me, he said, that was such a great experience for my Jamie. I mean, it was just one of the best things he did at Oxford. And I'm really, really glad that it was there for him, because I think he's going to understand the society we're going to live in a lot better than I do. And this is another campaign we had on the living wage. So this is where some of the Catholic social thought stuff I do comes in. We went to employers in Britain and talked to them about the wage scales they were paying. And this, again, was generated by these women who were cleaners at the big hotels. And they said, you know what, we can't live on what they pay us. Even though it is the legal minimum wage, it's not enough to live on. And a lot of them were afraid to engage the system because of their immigration status, or just because in their own countries they would never do anything like that. So working with us as academics and working with the students from Oxford, they felt empowered. And the students, and saw their lives in a very different way and were able to help them, gain better wages. City Safe was another anti-crime initiative we were involved in London, where there was a lot of knife crime amongst youth. We set up a scheme where young people could go into shops knowing that there were safe places. So let's say you're being chased by a bunch of knife-wielding thugs. There would be a sign on the shop or a light or something that would indicate to you that it was safe and that the shopkeeper would be your friend and you could go in. And how did that happen? Well, it was because the parents in the community met with the shopkeepers, the Muslim shopkeepers met with the Muslim families, and they created a whole scheme around this to help make their kids safe. Again, across ethnic and racial lines. And the other thing that's interesting about this, I mean, this is not how most of you probably imagine London, but this is what a lot of London is starting to look like. And it's not the London of, bobbies and tea, but they're British kids. So that's the community organizing work we've done. And I'll be happy to chat about it more. I know I've gone a little long, so I want to leave some time for questions. But there's a lot to talk about. But I hope that you found some of that basic information helpful and interesting, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. Thanks so much. Well, I mean, the community organizing model is based in Saul Alinsky's work, but it changes. I mean, obviously in London is not Chicago in the 1950s, so there are different issues. And the idea here too is that this is very much integrated into religious organizations. Saul Alinsky, I think, had a little hostility to some of the religious involvement, although I think he realized over time that was important. But the main thing we focus on is how do people of faith or people who are committed to their communities come together based on a sense of shared responsibility to the community that for many people is motivated from their faith, and work together for social change. And it's not a hostile thing, although sometimes you do have to be kind of in people's faces. For instance, for these cleaners, women, for them to get any respect, it took the Anglican vicar, my buddy Angus Ritchie, to go into the hotel and say, well, I'm Father Angus Ritchie, here to see the president of the hotel. Would you please have him? Here's my card. And of course, they come out immediately. And, well, Father, how may we help you? And he'd say, well, I actually think you're not paying your cleaners appropriately. And if you don't, we'll have to do a very, very unpleasant little gathering outside the hotel. That's not Saul Alinsky's way, but that's the British way. And people were always extraordinarily polite, but they're just sort of making their presence known. And I think one of the problems some people have with community organizing is it makes people uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable that they're actually asking for things that they deserve. Because by not asking, things stay the same. And I'll tell you, it makes me uncomfortable. I mean, I am not a community organizer by nature. I'm, totally imbued with my Southern parents' sense of, manners and decorum. But if a British vicar can do it, I can do it too. I mean, essentially, and it's just, people are sometimes using our sense that we don't want to cause trouble as a way of making sure that change doesn't happen. But these were changes that needed to happen. And they ultimately happened really because people would finally come together and actually talk as equals around the table. So maybe at his best, that's what Saul was trying to do, Saul Alinsky, but I think the whole model has evolved quite a bit since that time. Well, you know, that's a great question. I mean, when you look at the big metropolitan areas on the coasts, obviously they tend to lean Democratic. So one interesting thing is to say, well, the people who are living this actually their views seem somehow to reflect the reality of being in a metropolitan area, being more comfortable with social change, being more comfortable with immigration, at least writ large. But you're right, it still doesn't seem to, we still have these 50-50 elections, and we're not talking a 50-50 distribution population. Now here's the lawyer in me, the legal scholar, and my colleagues can jump in. You know, our political system, to some extent, is skewed against people who live in these areas. Because if you think about the Senate, for instance, and the Electoral College, North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska, that's 6 senators. New York gets 2, you know, Massachusetts gets 2, but how many more people do those 4 senators have to represent against those 6? And what kind of world do the people in Massachusetts and New York live in versus the people in Nebraska and North Dakota and South Dakota? So you have these people living in very different realities, but the political system was designed to equalize power amongst the states. And you know, the analysis here that I was focusing on really focuses on the much smaller entity of the county, because that's where people's lives really are, or a city. You know, the political system doesn't really allow for that reality to be expressed more broadly. So those areas where there are many fewer people that I was describing, like the Deep South, away from the cities, or the Intermountain West, have extraordinary political power in an election because those states, you know, do play a major hand in it. So part of this is really about rethinking how we understand our democratic system. Is it truly reflective in an appropriate way? Are we really experiencing a truly representative democracy, or are there structures in place that are preventing what you're describing? It seems to me that some of it is that, and some of it is that a lot of these people aren't yet politically mature. They don't feel comfortable really expressing themselves. All these young people, that seems to be changing, but you know, newly arrived citizens are often somewhat reticent to become too politically active. But there's definitely something amiss. I think that you raise a really important point. How does our work sort of translate into something new? I haven't been repeating the question, Star. And something to help current organizations. Actually, I think the 2 questions cohere, right? Because at the end of the day, what's going to change? I think one thing that has to change is that these new, vibrant metropolitan centers in the United States obviously need to exert a little bit more political power in the system. We need to energize more people in these communities to be politically active. And this organizing work is just one way of doing that. But it's not going to address the more structural issues, but I think over time, those will have to be addressed. But in the short term, you know, people in the big cities, on the coasts, want a single-payer healthcare system overall, if you look at the numbers. Why don't they get it? Well, the political structures don't allow it. But perhaps there needs to be more pressuring. The people who benefit from something like that need to make themselves known. So the organizations, I think, have to be better at motivating people to become, you know, sort of masters of their own destiny, to speak to the things that they need and want, which was what I really liked about our London work. We got people to talk about what was it that you need, what is it that you want, and we got them to actually make those things known to the power. So I think the more we can do that, the better off. The unions, what is the role of the unions? The unions in Britain obviously have a much more established presence, although we met a lot of resistance from the unions because they weren't that interested in being involved with religious communities. They were much more secular in their orientations. So the big hurdle we had in England was not that we didn't have strong unions. We have plenty of strong unions. It was the religion thing. And so once they started realizing that the only way they were going to really penetrate some of these new workers, a lot of whom were actively involved in Catholic parishes and Muslim community organizations, was to demonstrate a respect for that place from which they come. And that's the way we started bringing the unions. The unions had to get over their fear of religion and in the interest of embracing new members. And I think in the United States we have a different problem with the union. I mean, the union movement has become somewhat moribund, probably because of our strong libertarian leanings. Increasingly people feel that groups don't serve their needs. And so how do we get over the kind of individualist leanings that so many Americans have? You know, and they vote for right-to-work laws and other things because they believe that they can do everything on their own. and they don't see the benefit of working as a group. And I think actually Catholic social teaching is a great way of teaching people about the power of community and getting them to recognize that situation in community is an incredibly important part of our humanity, but we haven't been, I guess, as good as we need to be in making that. And a lot of religious communities have the similar message. That's why the religious networks in Britain work so well. The Muslims and the Jewish community and the Protestant communities and the Catholics are all sort of tapping into this idea of the importance of people being situated socially. But it's a lot harder here, I think. Well, you raised so many interesting questions that are deeply embedded in this very general overview, this sort of 1,000-mile overview. You know, these are a lot of the academic questions that we struggle with. I mean, what does it mean to be a citizen? How can you really be a dual citizen? What are your responsibilities? Those are all really difficult questions, but I wanted to focus on your first point. So, question, how do you manage all this? Answer, it's very difficult. We're working on it. But other question, what about all these sort of identities that we're asked to claim in the United States? Well, one of the reasons I focused on the huge youth population in our areas that I've identified is young people are actually challenging the American notion of race and identity in very profound ways. The New York Times did a very interesting series this past year on racial identity based on the census. And the fastest growing group in the country, racial group, is the multiracial group. Because, I mean, this is my own little bugaboo, but the American notion of racial duality is extraordinarily simplistic and very, dualistic in a way that doesn't really match most human experience. So it's not at all surprising to me that people are pushing away from that. And it's also associated with a very troubled history in this country, the black-white duality. So it's not surprising to me that young people who didn't experience it don't want to be identified with it. And again, that's not the kind of thing that you can really make a judgment about. It's just happening. It will happen. And what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with it as a country? How are we going to deal with a group of young people who will refuse to identify themselves racially or in other ways that we have traditionally become accustomed to? So I think one of the things that those of us who are a bit older need to think about is how do we channel that clear desire for different ways of thinking about identity into something positive? And I think actually this kind of cosmopolitan multicultural community is a way of helping us frame things that can address a lot of the problems that ethnic identification and racial identification were designed to do in the census and things like that, distribution of resources and things like that. But it's going to be a big, big challenge. So I guess just to restate your question briefly is, you could draw a very different conclusion from the one I'm drawing, that this multicultural cosmopolitan world is a good thing and will, energize us. You could say, well, no, it's actually going to drive us apart. And there have been those authors who've said, at the core, we're an Anglo-European, Northern European society. Those are our values. You can come to it from any color, any context, but you have to adopt those values if you're going to be American. And, I guess that's really where the rubber hits the road. I mean, there are going to be some people who take that view. And I think John Hanafy's comments were to that point. I mean, our political system is basically dividing on that view, right? There is a way of being American, and this is what it is. And there's this other way of being American that is new. And some people like it, and some people don't. And it's a hard question. I personally don't think that we are well served by political rhetoric that collapses identity into what's comfortable for those who came first, and sort of equates identity with a certain ethnic or cultural or religious view of the world at a time when global mobility and global economy, all of those things are the realities we live with. I'm not saying it's easy. But I also like to point out that it's very disingenuous for people to say that, well, it used to be that we all did it one way. That's in the memories of certain people who had certain kinds of experiences. But as I said to you at the beginning of my talk, we have gone through waves of immigration like this before, actually waves where the percentage of the population that was immigrant was higher. In the early 20th century, it was higher. And those people just assimilated. They sort of act like it was magic, and they just behaved. But They didn't behave. First of all, they were segregated into ghettos. They couldn't get decent jobs. They were, you know, a lot of you probably remember, some of you from Irish communities and Italian communities, your parents or grandparents being unable to have certain kinds of privileges in the city of Boston. And, you know, yes, there was a kind of prescribed culture that if you wanted to have any chance of participating, you had to take on. But did people take that on willingly, or did they take that on for survival? And what the civil rights era has done is said to people that you can be yourself. And so people have chosen to be themselves more, and they've been allowed to retain aspects of their identity that previous generations would have been forced to jettison. And I don't know if that's something that should make us feel good, that those people had to do that. What we might want to try to think about is, how do we create an American society that is conscious of its many roots, its many currents, many backgrounds. I mean, I often talk about this as a Catholic. You know, I say, my family is from Louisiana, and that was a Latin, French, Catholic experience. It is not an Irish Catholic immigrant experience of the Northeast. It's a totally different Catholic experience. But what I've often faced is, well, you know, your Catholicism isn't really what American Catholicism is. I mean, I think, well, gee, I don't know. Louisiana's been around for 300 years. And my family's been there for 300 years. And the French have been Catholic for a long time, and the Spanish. Why is it that, you know, this way is the only way? And so when you have a very diverse religious group that still has trouble struggling with what it is, I think you can understand the problem. So it's a challenge that we, I think, need to embrace with a little bit more gusto and to be more positive. How does the media portray us as a society? Does the media portray really the society we're living in? And I think you're right, it often doesn't. I mean, it doesn't portray what I experience, you know, when, you know, I'm walking down a street in Boston most of the time, you know, even in a place like Newton. But I mean, it doesn't, you know, we're always so focused on externals. And there's so many things about the interactions we have with our communities, within our communities, that aren't reflected. But there's a mantra about what we're supposed to be on one side. And then there's, I guess, the other side that's sort of grasping for some way to create some cohesion around difference. And they're doing it through other vehicles, I guess, you know, empowering people through government and other things. And we as a nation just haven't come up with a coherent story about who we are that embraces the diversity of who we are, and then creates a narrative that's okay. I mean, it's okay that we all have come from these different, that some of us were slaves, and some of us were, you know, indentured servants, and some of us were plantation owners. Well, you know, that's just the way the world's always been. It's always been very complex, and there's always been power and privilege and, you know, people who were repressed. So let's own it. Let's own the fact that we've been able to transcend a lot of that, move beyond it. We've become a place of hope for new people. Maybe that's our story. Our story is this place that is very embracing of difference at the end of the day and allows people to transcend it and achieve at our best. But we seem to not want to make that our story. Well, in London, it was easy. When you get outside of London, it's sort of like here, when you get into places like the South here, where they're not used to having to engage that kind of diversity, or even, you know, Western Massachusetts. I mean, what happens when these new groups are appearing? How do people engage them? And sometimes people really do feel that, you know, this is not a conversation that we're willing to have. We know who we are, and you don't really fit. You can become one of us by rejecting that other stuff you do. But so those are the two extremes. You have the very vibrant spaces that are very multicultural, and then you have these other spaces which are kind of set in their ways. And I think a lot of the anxiety you're seeing in the United States, and in Britain too, over immigration has come not because of London's experience or New York's, but because some of the places in this country now that are facing a lot of immigration are evangelical epicenters, or, I mean, not to the same degree, but, you know, small towns in the West and the South that maybe never really had to deal with it. And it's a very jarring experience. They don't really have a history or a memory of how to do it. So those are the extremes. I think most places are somewhere in between. I think most people are want to be welcoming, but they also don't want to be told that the way they've been is wrong. So you need to find a way to create a conversation that says, it's not that your way is wrong and my way is right, it's just that the new way is going to probably have to be different because we're bringing different things to the table. But it is a big challenge. Well, So how do we deal with the balkanization problem, which is a problem? Although I think it's something that's in rapid transformation even here in Boston. I mean, my experience having been a student here 20 years ago and coming here now is I see a very different city. I think maybe for people who've been here, it doesn't seem as dramatic, but it seems very dramatic to me. You know, there's much less balkanization than I remember. I think people travel around the city much more freely and feel more comfortable in more places. And so that's a big, important change. I mean, there's less of this territoriality, that this is our neighborhood. So Chicago, same thing, was very much like Boston. Our neighborhood, outside or inside, or downtown is the sort of demilitarized zone. But it's a process. It's a process. And I think one of the reasons it's changing is that a lot of people, particularly wealthier people, actually seem to like the benefits, some of the benefits of diversity, better restaurants, more, you know, all these things that are happening. And they just want those things. So the market, in a way, drives this acceptance of the fact that, well, diversity is good because it makes my life more interesting. And you start to see this sort of trickle-down effect. I mean, I don't mean to be trivial, but a lot of the writing actually says that we see a tolerance amongst affluent people because they like to be around that kind of diversity. Now, they are often able to separate themselves from it, but they sort of articulate reasons why it should happen. And so I think as Boston has become a more affluent, accepting city, that's one of the changes. You know, urban gentrification and all these things have played into it. Same thing in Washington and New York. I mean, there's a much more of a sense that a vibrant city should be diverse, and people want to be in it, and they're coming in. Suburbanites are moving into the city. So some of it, I think, in some ways, the market helps change things. How do you keep it moving? I think by creating these community structures that allow people to be in conversation with one another. But that's a big question we can talk more about. Well, just to quickly summarize, so have things really changed? I think, in a way, what your question points to is something we were discussing earlier. The country is divided. I think the country is divided in very fundamental ways. People have very different views about the role of government, the role of the individual in society, and all of these things. And that affects how people engage. So I think what you're experiencing is real, and I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, but I do think there are some major improvements that have come about. And I'll just give you one example using Massachusetts. I mean, for all of the problems that you see here, Massachusetts has made extraordinary gains. I mean, the young people of this state are still much better educated than almost anywhere else in the country in the public schools here. So for all the failures that you see in your public schools, imagine if these children were in Texas or some of these other states that have just gutted the funding for public education. And where does that come from? It comes from a fundamental difference about the role that the government should play in the life of the society, and a fundamental difference on taxation. So those questions matter, and they play themselves out. And what I think is interesting, going back again to the earlier question, is in these very diverse, vibrant areas, there's been a decision about the role of the government that's very different from the decision that's made in Texas or Tennessee, and the results are palpable. You do see the difference. It's not perfect, but there is a difference. So can we control this global current of change? I'll make two short comments. One, you can control the market, because the market drives a lot of it. Our primary political system has shown a deep unwillingness to exert any kind of control over the market. They believe the market should be allowed to be left to its own devices. I don't hear enough discussion as to how that liberal economic view affects what we're experiencing on the ground in terms of immigration. Open borders for labor helps some people who are very wealthy in this country. And then there are the legal and other things that could be done, you know, better border control, all the things you hear about. And yes, I mean, all those things can be done, but again, there has not been a willingness to come together as a country on solutions. We just talk about it, because one side doesn't want to attack the government, and one side doesn't want to attack the market. So, you know, until we get honest about what we have to do to manage change, we're going to be sort of subject to change. I mean, we don't have any control over things that we're unwilling to deal with. So I take your point. I think it's a good one, but I just don't see the willingness to deal with it. Okay, I think I'm done, but I'll stay around and talk at the reception.
Thank you very much, Dean. We're very fortunate to have you this evening, and you've certainly given us a lot to think about.